They laughed at him. A 26-year-old lieutenant colonel with a degree in civil engineering, commanding a battalion of bridge builders and road scrapers, was about to face the most feared armored unit in the German military. The smart money said his men would be overrun in hours, remembered only as a footnote to a catastrophic Allied defeat. Instead, what David Perran did in the frozen forests of Belgium over 5 desperate days in December 1944 would break the back of Hitler's final gamble in the West. This is the story of how 600 engineers with slide rules, demolition charges, and impossible orders changed the outcome of World War II. The Ardennes Forest in winter is a place designed to kill hope. Towering fir trees block what little daylight filters through the perpetual December overcast, and the narrow valley roads twist through terrain so steep and forested that maps become suggestions rather than certainties. On the morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German soldiers crashed through that forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The initial attack achieved complete surprise. American units shattered. Communications collapsed. Entire companies vanished into the chaos. Leading the northern spearhead was Kampfgruppe Peiper, an armored battle group built around the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. At its tip rode 100 tanks and assault guns, accompanied by 4,000 of the most battle-hardened soldiers Germany could still field. Their commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, was 30 years old and had been fighting since Poland in 1939. He had led armored attacks across France, through the Balkans, deep into Russia. He knew how to exploit shock, how to keep momentum, how to turn breakthrough into rout. His orders were explicit. Punch through the American lines, seize the Meuse River bridges before the Allies could destroy them, and open the road to Antwerp. Speed was everything. Hesitation was death. Peiper had been given approximately 60 hours to cover 60 miles through enemy territory, seize multiple river crossings, and enable the follow-on forces that would complete Germany's most ambitious operation since 1940. The mission was audacious to the point of fantasy, dependent on captured American fuel, intact bridges, and demoralized opposition. What it required most of all was speed. Every minute lost was a minute the Allies could use to organize, reinforce, shift reserves. Peiper understood this instinctively. He drove his column with ruthless urgency, bypassing resistance, overrunning supply dumps, smashing through roadblocks. By the evening of December 17th, his lead elements had penetrated nearly 20 miles into American-held territory, leaving burning vehicles and stunned defenders in their wake. Standing directly in his path was Lieutenant Colonel David Perran. At 26 years old, Perran was young even by the standards of a war that had elevated captains to majors and majors to colonels based on casualty rates and operational necessity. A graduate of Cornell with a degree in civil engineering, he had been commissioned in 1940, trained in the construction and demolition of bridges, roads, and fortifications, and had led the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion through France since the summer. The 291st was not an infantry unit. Its men were trained to build Bailey bridges, clear minefields, repair roads under fire, and, when necessary, blow things up with scientific precision. They carried rifles and carbines, but their real weapons were slide rules, detonators, and an intimate understanding of structural failure points. On the afternoon of December 17th, Perran received orders that would have seemed absurd if they hadn't been delivered with such desperate urgency. His battalion was to move immediately to the Amblev River Valley, a winding corridor of stone bridges and forested ridges southeast of Liège. Intelligence reports, fragmentary and chaotic, indicated that a major German armored column was driving west along the valley roads. Perran's mission was straightforward in concept and nearly impossible in execution. Deny every bridge, every crossing, every kilometer of passable road to the German advance. Do not engage. Do not defend. Destroy and withdraw. Keep the enemy off balance, keep them guessing, keep them slow. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion numbered approximately 600 men organized into 4 companies. They possessed trucks, jeeps, engineer equipment, small arms, and a substantial inventory of TNT, composition C, and plastic explosive. What they did not possess was armor, artillery, air support, or any realistic hope of stopping a panzer column in direct combat. Perran understood this. His officers understood this. The question was whether demolition alone could achieve what firepower could not. By midnight on December 17th, advance elements of the 291st had reached the Amblev Valley and begun reconnaissance of the bridge sites. The terrain was a demolition engineer's nightmare. Narrow valley roads carved into hillsides, stone bridges built by Belgian masons decades earlier, rivers swollen with winter rain rushing over rocky beds 30 feet below. Each bridge was different. Each required a unique demolition plan based on its construction, load-bearing points, and the time available to prepare charges. Perran studied the maps by flashlight, calculating distances, estimating travel times, wargaming the sequence of events that would unfold once Peiper's column entered the valley. The first bridge was at Habimont, a small stone arch spanning a tributary of the Amblev barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. It was also the most forward position, closest to the advancing Germans, and therefore the most dangerous to prepare. Perran assigned the job to a demolition team from a company, 8 men under a sergeant named Billington who had worked construction in Pennsylvania before the war and understood stone better than most engineers understood steel. They reached the bridge at 3 in the morning on December 18th, working by the faint glow of hooded flashlights, drilling holes into the mortar, packing composition C into the foundation piers. The night was cold enough that their breath froze in clouds, cold enough that the plastic explosive became stiff and difficult to shape. Behind them, perhaps 5 miles to the east, they could hear the distant rumble of heavy vehicles. Time became an obsession. Perran had established a communication network using field telephones strung along the valley roads. But the system was fragile, dependent on lines that could be cut by shellfire or simply by a truck backing over them in the dark. He needed to know where Peiper was, how fast he was moving, when each demolition team could expect contact. The information came in fragments. A reconnaissance patrol reported vehicles with blackout lights moving through Lignaville. Another spotted tank silhouettes against the skyline near Stavelot. Perran plotted the sightings on his map and watched the German advance compress his timeline. If Peiper maintained his current speed, the lead elements would reach Habimont by dawn. The demolition team at Habimont finished placing charges at 4:30 a.m. They ran detonation wire back to a firing position in the tree line 50 yards from the bridge, tested the circuit, and settled in to wait. Billington had served in North Africa and Italy. He had blown bridges under fire before, knew the sick feeling of watching enemy vehicles approach while praying the charges were packed correctly. The wiring was solid. The detonator would function. This time felt different. The Germans coming up the road weren't rear echelon troops or demoralized garrison units. They were SS Panzer, the kind of soldiers who would not stop, would not hesitate, would roll straight through until something physical blocked their path. At 5:40 a.m., with the sky still dark and a light snow beginning to fall, the first German vehicle appeared around the eastern bend. It was a SDKF Z251 half-track, moving cautiously, its commander standing in the open hatch scanning the road ahead. Behind it came another, then the unmistakable angular silhouette of a Panther tank, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly as it advanced. Billington pressed himself into the frozen ground and watched them come. The half-tracks reached the bridge. One of them stopped, and soldiers dismounted, weapons ready, eyes searching the tree line for ambush. The Panther continued forward onto the bridge itself, its weight settling onto the stone arch with a grinding of treads on masonry. Billington twisted the detonator handle. The explosion was not the dramatic fireball of Hollywood imagination, but a sharp, brutal crack followed by a billowing cloud of dust and pulverized stone. The center span of the bridge dropped away, taking the Panther with it, the tank's rear pitching upward before the entire vehicle tumbled into the streambed below. The half-tracks reversed frantically, engines screaming, but the damage was done. The road was blocked. The column was stopped. Billington's team evacuated their position immediately, moving west through the forest toward the next demolition site, leaving the Germans to stare at the wreckage and recalculate their route. Joachim Peiper received word of the Habimont demolition at approximately 6 a.m. His initial reaction was fury. He had anticipated American resistance, expected roadblocks and defensive positions, But a demolished bridge this far forward indicated planning and preparation that should not have been possible given the speed of his advance. It suggested someone on the American side understood exactly what his mission required and was working systematically to deny it. He ordered his reconnaissance elements to find an alternate route, a bypass, another bridge, anything to maintain momentum. They returned within the hour with bad news. The terrain offered no easy detour. The roads were narrow, the forests impassable to armor, the alternate bridges small and probably rigged for demolition. Peiper made the only decision available to him. Push forward, maintain pressure, accept delays but minimize them. His engineers would construct a bypass at Habimont. The column would continue. David Perran learned of the successful demolition through a field telephone report at 6:15 a.m. He allowed himself 30 seconds of relief before returning to the map and the growing list of problems. Habimont was down, but Peiper had at least a dozen other potential crossing sites within striking distance, and the 291st had to cover all of them with finite resources and almost no margin for error. He issued orders for the next demolitions. Trois-Ponts, where the Amblev and Somme rivers converged in a natural choke point defended by 3 stone bridges. Chenus, a smaller bridge 4 miles northwest. Habimont, not to be confused with Habimont, another crossing farther west. Each site required a demolition team. Each team required time to prepare charges, and time was the one commodity Perran could not manufacture. The bridge at Trois-Ponts was the strategic linchpin of the entire valley. If Peiper captured it intact, he could turn north toward Liège or continue west toward the Meuse, opening multiple axes of advance. If Perran destroyed it, he would force Peiper into a series of narrow secondary roads where traffic jams and fuel shortages could paralyze an entire Kampfgruppe. The problem was that Trois-Ponts was also a town, inhabited by Belgian civilians who had already endured 4 years of occupation and were now watching American engineers wire their bridges with enough explosive to level half the buildings along the waterfront. Perran ordered the evacuation of the immediate area, knowing full well that many residents would refuse to leave their homes. He assigned 2 full platoons to the demolition, giving them every available pound of TNT and Composition C. The work began at dawn on December 18th. By midday, Peiper's column had bypassed the Habimont crater and resumed its westward drive. His lead elements overran American supply dumps at Boulingen and Ligneville, capturing desperately needed fuel and ammunition. His tanks were now moving with renewed aggression, the momentum he needed to salvage the operation. But the delays were accumulating. Habimont had cost him 3 hours. The bypass roads were treacherous, slowing his column to a crawl. His scouts reported another demolished bridge at Stavelot, forcing yet another detour. Each obstacle chewed away at the 60-hour timeline. Each delay widened the window for Allied reinforcements. At Trois-Ponts, the demolition crews worked through December 18th under increasingly desperate conditions. German artillery had found the range, and shells were falling into the town at irregular intervals, cratering roads and collapsing buildings. The engineers continued drilling, packing charges into the bridge piers with methodical precision, even as masonry dust and fragments rained down from near misses. By evening, all 3 bridges were wired, with detonation lines running to a command post in a stone farmhouse on the western edge of town. Perran arrived personally to inspect the setup, walking across each bridge to verify charge placement, checking circuits, making the mental calculations that would determine whether the explosives would drop the spans cleanly or merely damage them enough for German engineers to repair. He stood on the center of the main bridge, looking down at the black water 30 feet below, and allowed himself to consider what failure would mean. If the charges misfired, if the bridges only partially collapsed, if Peiper's engineers could span the gaps quickly enough, then the entire German column would pour through Trois-Ponts and the road to the Meuse would lie open. The northern thrust of the Bulge offensive would succeed. Allied forces would be split. The war that had seemed nearly won would grind on for months, perhaps years. Tens of thousands more would die, and it would be because he, David Perran, age 26, had miscalculated the demolition of a bridge in Belgium. The weight of that knowledge was extraordinary. He was not a frontline infantryman making split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. He was an engineer trained to think in terms of stress loads, blast radii, and mathematical certainty. Yet here he was, forced to gamble everything on charges he had packed himself, detonators he had tested in training but never under these conditions, and a sequence of events he could plan but not control. If he blew the bridges too early, the Germans might find another crossing before he could reposition his forces. If he waited too long, his demolition teams would be overrun. The timing had to be perfect, which meant it had to be intuitive, a judgment call made in seconds based on incomplete information and the distant sound of tank engines growing louder. On the morning of December 19th, Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the outskirts of Trois-Ponts. By this point, Peiper had been driving his column for more than 60 hours with minimal sleep, sustained by a mixture of amphetamines, coffee, and the knowledge that his entire operational window was collapsing. He had fallen behind schedule. His fuel situation was critical. Captured American supplies had kept him moving, but consumption always exceeded supply in armored warfare, and the detours and delays had burned through his reserves faster than planned. He needed Trois-Ponts. He needed it intact. He needed it now. His reconnaissance reported that the bridges were prepared for demolition but had not yet been destroyed. This gave him hope. If he moved fast enough, if he could seize at least one bridge before the Americans could react, he could get his lead elements across and force the issue. He ordered an immediate assault, tanks forward, infantry mounted, hit them hard and keep moving. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the first Panthers emerged from the forest road and accelerated toward the town. The American engineers at the command post heard them coming before they saw them. The distinctive roar of Maybach engines, the metallic clatter of tracks on frozen ground, the hydraulic whine of turrets traversing. The officer in charge of the demolition, a captain named Gamble, watched through binoculars as the lead tank broke into the open and made directly for the bridge. His hand rested on the detonator plunger. His orders were explicit. Wait until the maximum number of vehicles were committed, then blow all 3 bridges simultaneously. The problem was that maximum number was a judgment call, and making the wrong call meant either wasting the opportunity or losing the bridges entirely. The Panther reached the bridge approach and accelerated, its commander clearly intent on crossing at speed before the Americans could react. Behind it came 2 more Panthers, a pair of SDKF Z-251s, and what looked like a company of Panzer Grenadiers on foot. Gamble watched them funnel onto the narrow bridge, counted silently, and made his decision. He pressed the plunger down hard. The explosion at Trois-Ponts was one of the largest deliberate demolitions of the war in Europe. 3 bridges, thousands of pounds of high explosive, detonating within seconds of each other in a confined river valley produced a blast wave that shattered windows a mile away and sent a column of smoke and debris 500 feet into the air. The lead Panther disappeared in the initial fireball, engulfed by the collapsing bridge deck before it could reverse. The vehicles behind it slewed to a halt, their crews bailing out and diving for cover as secondary explosions cooked off ammunition and fuel. When the smoke cleared, all 3 bridges were gone, reduced to jagged stone pilings and twisted steel reinforcement bars jutting from the river. Joachim Peiper stood on the eastern bank of the Amblev and watched his timetable disintegrate. He had lost men, lost tanks, and lost any realistic hope of reaching his objectives on schedule. The Americans had not fought him in the conventional sense. They had not held defensive lines or counterattacked or done any of the things he had been trained to overcome. They had simply erased his route of advance, methodically and with perfect timing, forcing him to waste hours searching for crossings that no longer existed. He turned to his operations officer and ordered yet another reconnaissance, another search for another bridge, knowing even as he gave the order that the Americans would already be ahead of him. David Perran learned of the Trois-Ponts demolition at 10 a.m. on December 19th. The report came through the field telephone network, crackling and distorted but unmistakable. All 3 bridges down, German columns stopped, enemy consolidating east of the river. He marked the position on his map and began calculating the next moves. Peiper would not give up. He would probe north, probe south, search for any crossing that could get him back on track. Perran had to anticipate those moves, position his remaining demolition teams, continue destroying infrastructure faster than the Germans could advance. The 291st had been in continuous operation for more than 48 hours. The men were exhausted, working on adrenaline and coffee, moving from demolition site to demolition site with barely enough time to prepare charges before the next German probe arrived. Perran rotated teams when he could, but there were never enough men, never enough time. Engineers who had spent the morning wiring a bridge would spend the afternoon laying minefields, then move to another site and start the process again. They worked in snow, in mud, under shellfire, knowing that one miscalculation would not only cost their lives but potentially alter the outcome of the entire offensive. The bridges at Chenus and Habimont fell on December 20th. Both demolitions were textbook operations. Charges placed, circuits tested, bridges blown just as German reconnaissance vehicles came into view. But the cumulative effect was beginning to show. Kampfgruppe Peiper was no longer a cohesive armored spearhead but a fragmented column strung out across 20 miles of impassable terrain. Tanks idling in traffic jams, infantry units separated from their vehicles, fuel trucks stuck on roads too narrow to allow passing. The blitzkrieg that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 60 hours had been reduced to a slow, grinding advance that consumed resources without gaining ground. On December 21st, Peiper made a final desperate attempt to break through at the village of La Glise. He concentrated his remaining armor, approximately 50 tanks and assault guns, and launched an attack westward along a narrow ridge road that offered one of the few remaining routes toward the Meuse. The attack ran directly into elements of the 30th Infantry Division, reinforced by tank destroyers and artillery, and for the first time since the offensive began, Peiper found himself in a conventional battle he could not win. The Americans had used the time Perran's demolitions had bought them to establish defensive positions, bring up reserves, and coordinate firepower. The German attack stalled, then collapsed. By evening, Peiper was surrounded, low on fuel, low on ammunition, and completely out of time. The destruction of Kampfgruppe Peiper did not end the Battle of the Bulge, but it broke the back of the northern thrust. The delays imposed by the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, measured in hours and then days, had created cascading failures throughout the German operational plan. Units that were supposed to be across the Meuse by December 19th were still struggling to cross the Amblève on December 21st. Follow-on forces that depended on Peiper's breakthrough found themselves stuck in traffic jams behind demolished bridges. Fuel supplies that should have been captured from American depots were never taken because the advance never reached them. The entire intricate mechanism of Hitler's offensive, dependent on speed and surprise, had been wrecked by the methodical work of 600 engineers who understood that destroying infrastructure was as decisive as destroying tanks. David Perran's battalion continued operations throughout the Bulge, demolishing roads, clearing minefields, and eventually building the bridges that would carry Allied forces back into Germany. In March 1945, elements of the 291st were among the first Allied units to cross the Rhine at Remagen, arriving in time to reinforce the captured Ludendorff Bridge before German counterattacks could destroy it. The work was less dramatic than the Ardennes demolitions but no less vital. Building Bailey bridges under fire, clearing obstacles, keeping supply routes open. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions in the Ardennes, one of the highest honors that could be awarded to an entire unit. The citation praised the battalion's outstanding performance of duty in action against the enemy, and specifically noted the demolitions that had delayed Kampfgruppe Peiper. David Perran himself received the Distinguished Service Cross and would later write a memoir titled First Across the Rhine, a detailed account of the battalion's operations that remains one of the few comprehensive records of engineer combat in World War II. But recognition came slowly and incompletely. The engineers who blew the bridges at Habimont, Trois-Ponts, Chenus, and a dozen other locations did not receive the same public attention as the infantry units that held Bastogne or the armored divisions that encircled the German salient. There were no dramatic photographs of engineers at detonator plungers, no newsreel footage of bridges collapsing, no iconic images to capture the public imagination. The work was technical, unglamorous, easy to overlook in the larger narrative of heroic last stands and armored counterattacks. Yet the mathematics were undeniable. Kampfgruppe Peiper, designed to spearhead the most important German offensive in the West since 1940, had been stopped by bridge demolitions. Not by superior firepower, not by overwhelming numbers, but by the systematic destruction of infrastructure and the time it took to find alternatives. Every bridge that fell forced a detour. Every detour consumed fuel. Every hour of delay gave the Allies time to react. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for German operational planning and ultimately contributed to the failure of the entire offensive. The engineers who executed those demolitions did so under conditions that would have broken most combat units. They worked within sight of enemy armor, knowing that if they were spotted before the charges were ready, they would be overrun. They stood on bridges packed with enough explosive to vaporize them, waiting for the precise moment when detonation would do the most damage. They made decisions in seconds that affected the lives of thousands and the course of battles. And they did it not with the adrenaline of close combat but with the cold calculation of technical precision, understanding that their margin for error was zero. David Perran understood this better than anyone. He had trained his men to think of demolition not as destruction but as engineering in reverse. The same principles of load-bearing and structural integrity applied to the problem of making things fall down instead of stay up. He had taught them to calculate blast radii, estimate material requirements, design demolition schemes that would drop a bridge cleanly rather than merely damage it. But he had also taught them to make those calculations under pressure, to function when the textbooks didn't apply, to trust their judgment when there was no time for second opinions. In the years after the war, Perran would reflect on those December days in Belgium with a mixture of pride and lingering anxiety. He knew how close it had been, how many times success had depended on timing measured in seconds, how easily the entire operation could have failed. If the Habimont charges had misfired, if the Trois-Ponts demolition had been delayed by another 60 seconds, if any of a dozen critical decisions had gone differently, Kampfgruppe Peiper might have broken through. The Mule bridges might have fallen intact. The northern thrust might have succeeded, and the history of the war's final months would have been written very differently. But the charges had not misfired. The demolitions had not been delayed. The decisions had been correct. 600 engineers with slide rules and TNT had stopped an SS Panzer division, and in doing so had helped preserve the Allied advance toward Germany. It was not the kind of victory that generated headlines, but it was perhaps the purest example of how wars are actually won. Not through individual acts of heroism, though there was heroism in abundance, but through competence, planning, and the ability to execute complex operations under impossible conditions. The engineers of the 291st understood something that is often lost in popular narratives of war, that the decisive moments are not always the ones that make the best stories, that holding a bridge can matter less than destroying it at the right time, that a 26-year-old lieutenant colonel with a civil engineering degree can affect the course of history as much as any tank commander or infantry general, if he understands what the situation requires and has the nerve to see it through. Joachim Peiper survived the war, was tried for war crimes related to the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy, and eventually settled in France where he was assassinated in 1976 by unknown attackers. David Perran returned to civilian life, worked in construction, and maintained contact with the veterans of the 291st until his death. The bridges they destroyed in December 1944 were rebuilt, stronger and wider, and today carry traffic that includes tourists who have no idea what happened there. But the river valleys remain, and the distances remain, and anyone who studies the maps can see what Perran saw. That there were only so many places an armored column could cross, only so many routes that could support heavy vehicles, and that destroying those crossing points at the right moment was not just tactically sound but strategically decisive. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for Bastogne, for the desperate defense of road junctions and small Belgian towns, for the heroism of infantry units fighting in freezing conditions against overwhelming odds. All of that is true and important, but it is incomplete without the story of the engineers who made that defense possible by buying time, kilometer by kilometer, bridge by bridge, until the tide could turn. Wars are won by many things: courage, firepower, logistics, strategy. But sometimes they are won by engineers who understand that destruction, precisely applied, is its own form of creation. That every bridge denied to the enemy is a bridge built for your own forces. That time, even measured in hours, can be as valuable as divisions. And that knowing when to press the detonator is as important as knowing how to pack the charges. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion gave the Allied command the one thing it needed most in December 1944: time. Time to react, time to reinforce, time to organize the counteroffensive that would eventually crush the German salient and send the Wehrmacht reeling back toward the Rhine. They bought that time with technical skill, physical courage, and a willingness to stand on bridges packed with explosives while watching enemy tanks approach. They were not celebrated as heroes in the conventional sense, but they were exactly what the situation required: competent professionals executing an impossible mission with precision and nerve. If you found the story compelling, if you think more people should know what the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion accomplished in those desperate December days, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. History is full of stories like this, stories of technical expertise and quiet competence changing the course of wars, stories that never made it into the popular narrative because they weren't dramatic enough or because the people involved were too busy doing the work to publicize it. How many other stories like this are still waiting to be told? How many times has history turned on the decisions of people whose names we don't know, whose actions never made the newsreels, whose contribution was so specialized that it got buried in after-action reports and forgotten? If you think those stories matter, if you believe that understanding how wars are actually won requires more than just studying the famous battles and celebrated generals, then this is the place for you. And here's a question worth considering. In an age of drones, cyber warfare, and precision-guided munitions, do we still depend on individuals like David Perran and the engineers of the 291st? Or has modern warfare evolved beyond the point where individual decisions at the tactical level can affect strategic outcomes? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.